The morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside like a shroud of foreboding as Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison of the Second Corps adjusted his field glasses one final time. It was June 3rd, 1864, and the air itself seemed to whisper of impending doom. Behind the hastily constructed Confederate earthworks at Cold Harbor, 22,000 Union soldiers prepared for what their commanders promised would be the decisive blow against Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Morrison had witnessed the carnage at Spotsylvania and the Wilderness, but something felt different about this dawn. The men around him, boys from Massachusetts farms and Pennsylvania coal mines, clutched their rifles with white knuckles, their faces bearing the hollow expression of soldiers who had seen too much death in too few weeks. Many had pinned pieces of paper to their uniforms with their names and addresses, a grim acknowledgement of what they expected to find at the end of this day. General Ulysses Simpson Grant's relentless overland campaign had been grinding forward for over a month, leaving a trail of unprecedented casualties in its wake. The Union Army had lost nearly 50,000 men since crossing the Rapidan River in early May, yet Grant's determination remained unshaken. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he had declared, and now Cold Harbor would test that resolve like no battle before. The Confederate position stretched along a 7-mile front, anchored by natural ridges, and reinforced with an intricate network of trenches, abatis, and artillery positions that had been strengthened over several days. Lee's veterans, though outnumbered, occupied what many military historians would later describe as one of the strongest defensive positions of the entire war. According to accounts preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Confederate engineers had created overlapping fields of fire that would prove devastatingly effective against any frontal assault. As Morrison surveyed the enemy lines through the lifting fog, he could see the glint of Confederate rifle barrels protruding from their earthworks like the spines of some massive, deadly creature. The rebels had learned well from 3 years of brutal warfare, transforming their position into a fortress that seemed to mock the very idea of a successful assault. Artillery pieces, positioned at carefully calculated intervals, commanded every approach with mathematical precision. Behind Morrison, the massive Union force stirred to life. Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps, Horatio Gouverneur Wright's Sixth Corps, and William Farrar Smith's 18th Corps formed the primary assault force, while Governor Kemble Warren's Fifth Corps and Philip Henry Sheridan's cavalry provided support. The sound of 50,000 men preparing for battle created a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The scrape of bayonets being fixed, the clink of canteens, the whispered prayers of men facing their mortality. The plan, such as it was, called for a coordinated assault across the Confederate front at 4:30 in the morning. Grant and his lieutenant, George Gordon Meade, believed that a swift, overwhelming attack would break Lee's lines before the rebels could concentrate their fire effectively. It was a strategy born of desperation and hubris, reflecting Grant's growing impatience with the war's grinding pace and his underestimation of Lee's defensive capabilities. Morrison checked his pocket watch. 4:25. In 5 minutes, the order would come, and 22,000 Americans would rise from their positions and advance toward what many would later remember as one of the most tragic miscalculations in military history. The lieutenant colonel whispered a final prayer and prepared to lead his men into the maelstrom that would forever change how America remembered the true cost of war. The signal came not with fanfare, but with the harsh blast of bugles cutting through the morning air like screams. Morrison rose from his position, sword raised, and bellowed the command that would echo in his nightmares for years to come. "Forward, boys! For the Union!" 22,000 men surged forward across the open ground toward the Confederate earthworks, their battle cries creating a roar that momentarily drowned out even the thunder of artillery. For the first 100 yards, hope lived. The Union soldiers advanced with the precision of a parade ground drill, their lines dressed and their colors flying proudly in the morning breeze. Morrison felt a surge of pride as he watched his Massachusetts men maintain their formation despite the uneven ground and scattered obstacles. Perhaps, he thought, the intelligence reports had been wrong about the strength of the rebel position. Then the killing began. The Confederate fire opened with a precision that spoke of careful preparation and deadly intent. Artillery shells, loaded with canister shot, turned entire sections of the advancing Union line into clouds of red mist and scattered limbs. Rifles, positioned in carefully constructed firing positions, delivered volley after devastating volley into the packed ranks of blue-clad soldiers. The sound was unlike anything Morrison had ever experienced, a continuous roar of explosions and rifle fire that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Private William Henderson of the 5th Massachusetts fell beside Morrison, his face a mask of surprise as blood poured from a wound in his chest. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, a veteran of Gettysburg, simply disappeared in the explosion of a Confederate shell, leaving only his rifle standing upright in the mud like a grave marker. The carefully maintained battle lines dissolved into chaos as men fell by the hundreds, their bodies creating obstacles that tripped and slowed their advancing comrades. Morrison pressed forward, driven by duty and desperation, but the mathematics of the assault were already becoming clear. The Confederate position, strengthened by days of preparation, created interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. As recorded in later testimony before Congress, rebel soldiers could hardly miss as they poured continuous fire into the dense masses of attacking Union troops. Some Confederate units reported that their rifle barrels became too hot to touch as they maintained their murderous rate of fire. The Second Corps, attacking on the Union right, managed to advance furthest before being stopped by concentrated artillery fire from batteries positioned on high ground. Hancock's men, veterans of numerous battles, pushed to within 50 yards of the Confederate earthworks before a withering crossfire forced them to seek whatever shelter they could find in the torn and bloody ground. Wright's 6th Corps, advancing in the center, faced an even more devastating reception as Confederate engineers had positioned their strongest defenses directly in the path of the main assault. By 5 o'clock in the morning, barely 30 minutes after the assault began, the attack had effectively ended. The open ground between the lines was carpeted with Union casualties, their bodies creating a ghastly testament to the futility of the assault. Morrison, miraculously unwounded but psychologically shattered, found himself lying in a shallow depression with the survivors of his regiment, listening to the cries of wounded men who lay exposed in the deadly no-man's land between the armies. The most tragic aspect of the disaster was its predictability. Confederate soldiers, watching the massive Union formation advance across the open ground, had time to carefully aim their shots and coordinate their fire for maximum effect. Captain Robert Stiles of the Richmond Howitzers later wrote that his men actually felt sympathy for the courage of their enemies, even as they systematically destroyed the attacking force with methodical precision. As the sun climbed higher, the true scope of the catastrophe became apparent. Union casualties mounted not just from the initial assault, but from the continuous fire that prevented any attempt at rescue or retreat. Wounded soldiers, unable to move from their exposed positions, faced the choice of bleeding to death or risking death by attempting to crawl back to their own lines through the kill zone that Cold Harbor had become. The silence that followed the failed assault was more terrifying than the battle itself. Morrison lay pressed against the blood-soaked earth, his uniform torn and stained, listening to the agonized cries of wounded men scattered across the field like broken dolls. The morning sun, climbing higher in a cloudless Virginia sky, began to beat down mercilessly on the exposed casualties, adding the torture of thirst and heat to their already unbearable suffering. Between the opposing lines, roughly 200 yards of open ground had been transformed into what soldiers would later describe as a vision of hell itself. Hundreds of Union soldiers lay motionless, their bodies twisted in the unnatural positions of violent death. Others, wounded but still alive, called desperately for water, for their mothers, for anyone who might end their agony. The Confederate earthworks, scarred but intact, stood like a fortress wall that had successfully repelled an invasion from another world. Sergeant Major Timothy Walsh, a veteran of Antietam and Chancellorsville, crawled up beside Morrison with a grim assessment. "Colonel, we've lost near half the regiment in 30 minutes, he whispered, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the assault. "The boys who ain't dead are either wounded or too scared to move. What do we do now?" Morrison had no answer that wouldn't sound like surrender or suicide. The tactical situation had become a nightmare of military impossibility. Any attempt to retreat would expose the survivors to the same devastating fire that had destroyed the assault force. Any attempt to advance would be pure suicide against positions that had already proven impregnable. The Union soldiers found themselves trapped in a killing ground where movement in any direction meant death, while remaining stationary meant slowly dying from exposure and thirst. Confederate sharpshooters, positioned in concealed rifle pits, maintained a steady fire against any Union soldier foolish enough to raise his head above ground level. Captain Thomas Blake of the 4th Georgia Infantry later recalled that his men had clear shots at ranges of less than 100 yards, making accurate fire almost automatic. The rebels, protected by carefully constructed earthworks, could maintain their deadly vigil with minimal risk to themselves. As the hours passed, the psychological toll on both sides began to mount. Union soldiers, pinned down in their exposed positions, developed what modern military medicine would recognize as combat stress reaction. Men who had fought bravely through dozens of battles found themselves paralyzed by the hopelessness of their situation. Some began to weep openly, others muttered incoherently to themselves, and a few simply stared into space with the empty gaze of minds that had witnessed too much horror. The Confederate soldiers, despite their tactical success, were also affected by the carnage they had inflicted. Many later wrote in their diaries about the difficulty of watching brave men die so uselessly, even when those men were their enemies. Private John Cassler of the 33rd Virginia wrote to his wife that the sight of so many Union casualties made even the hardest hearts among us feel pity for our enemies' courage, even as we rejoiced in their defeat. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had risen to nearly 90 degrees, and the smell of death began to permeate the battlefield. Wounded men, exposed to the merciless sun without water or medical attention, began to die not from their wounds, but from dehydration and heat stroke. The strategic brilliance of Lee's defensive position was matched only by the human tragedy of Grant's tactical miscalculation, creating a situation that would haunt military planners for generations to come. Morrison, still trapped with his surviving men, began to understand that Cold Harbor represented more than just another failed assault. This was a fundamental challenge to the Union strategy of overwhelming Confederate positions through superior numbers and aggressive tactics. The mathematics of defensive warfare, when combined with modern rifle technology and prepared positions, had created a new reality where courage and determination were no longer sufficient to guarantee victory. The brave men dying around him were casualties not just of Confederate fire, but of outdated military thinking that had failed to adapt to the realities of mid-19th century warfare. Night fell on Cold Harbor like a merciful curtain, finally providing cover for the desperate rescue attempts that had been impossible during the daylight hours. Morrison, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper after hours of encouraging his trapped men, organized small parties to crawl forward and drag wounded soldiers back to the relative safety of the Union lines. The work was dangerous and heartbreaking, as many of the wounded had died during the long, hot day, their final moments spent calling for help that could not safely reach them. The casualty reports that began filtering back to Union headquarters painted a picture of unprecedented disaster. In less than 1 hour of actual fighting, Grant's army had suffered over 7,000 casualties, with some regiments losing more than 60% of their strength. The 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, fighting as infantry, had entered the battle with 900 men and emerged with fewer than 200 effective soldiers. Such losses, concentrated in such a brief period, represented a level of tactical failure that would reshape military thinking for decades to come. General Grant, receiving the initial reports in his field headquarters, displayed the stoic demeanor that had earned him his reputation, but those close to him noted a subtle change in his bearing. Colonel Horace Porter, one of Grant's staff officers, later wrote in his memoirs that the general paced his tent throughout the night, occasionally pausing to stare at the map of Virginia as if searching for some alternative that might justify the day's terrible cost. The man who had declared his intention to fight it out on this line was beginning to confront the human price of his aggressive strategy. The Confederate response to their overwhelming tactical success was notably restrained. General Lee, though pleased with his army's performance, took no satisfaction in the enemy's suffering and immediately began planning for Grant's inevitable next move. According to accounts preserved in Douglas Southall Freeman's definitive biography of Lee, the Confederate commander spent the evening visiting his wounded soldiers and discussing defensive improvements with his engineers, treating the victory as simply another step in an ongoing campaign rather than a cause for celebration. The true scope of the disaster became apparent when rescue parties, working under cover of darkness, discovered that many of the Union casualties bore those pathetic pieces of paper with their names and addresses that soldiers had pinned to their uniforms before the assault. These improvised identification tags, intended to help families recover bodies, served as heartbreaking testimony to the soldiers' prescient understanding of their fate. The sight of these crude dog tags scattered across the battlefield would remain one of the war's most poignant symbols of wasted courage. Morrison, finally able to assess his regiment's losses in the flickering light of field lanterns, discovered that his unit had suffered casualties approaching 70%. Men he had known for 2 years, boys who had shared their rations with him, who had followed him through hell at Gettysburg and the Wilderness, were now names on a casualty list that seemed to stretch endlessly through the darkness. The mathematics of war had reduced human lives to statistics, but the emotional reality of those losses would haunt him for the rest of his days. The medical situation in the Union camps was catastrophic. Field hospitals, already overwhelmed by casualties from the previous month's fighting, simply could not handle the sudden influx of thousands of wounded men. Surgeons worked by lamplight, performing amputations and emergency procedures with the desperate efficiency of men trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Many wounded soldiers died not from their injuries, but from the simple lack of medical resources to treat them properly. As dawn approached on June 4th, both armies settled into the siege warfare that would characterize the remainder of the Cold Harbor engagement. The Union forces, bloodied but not broken, began digging their own defensive positions while contemplating the tactical lessons of the previous day's disaster. The Confederate Army, confident in their defensive capabilities, prepared for the prolonged struggle they knew would follow Grant's recognition that frontal assaults had become obsolete in the face of modern defensive warfare and improved rifle technology. The days following the disastrous assault transformed Cold Harbor from a battlefield into a charnel house, where the living were forced to coexist with the dead. Morrison, promoted to temporary command of his decimated regiment, found himself responsible for men whose spirits had been as thoroughly shattered as their ranks. The survivors of June 3rd moved through their daily routines like automatons, performing the mechanical tasks of military life, while their minds remained trapped in those terrible 30 minutes when their world had exploded into chaos and death. The Union Army, stunned by the magnitude of their failure, began the grim process of adapting to siege warfare. Trenches were dug with the desperate energy of men who had learned that protection lay only below ground level. The cheerful optimism that had characterized the early stages of Grant's overland campaign evaporated like morning dew, replaced by the sullen determination of soldiers who understood that their enemy had achieved tactical superiority through superior defensive positions and preparation. General Grant, his reputation for aggressive tactics now tempered by the reality of modern warfare, struggled to maintain the morale of an army that had suffered over 50,000 casualties in 6 weeks of fighting. His staff officers noted that the general's usual confidence had been replaced by a more cautious approach to tactical planning, as the lesson of Cold Harbor forced even the most aggressive Union commanders to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about Civil War combat. The most heartbreaking aspect of the post-battle period was the fate of the wounded who remained trapped in no man's land. Both sides could hear their cries for water and mercy, but neither could safely mount rescue operations during daylight hours. Confederate and Union soldiers, separated by only a few hundred yards of deadly ground, developed an informal understanding that allowed limited rescue efforts during the darkest hours of each night. But many wounded men died of thirst and exposure before help could reach them. Morrison's daily routine became a testament to the psychological toll of command during America's bloodiest conflict. Each morning, he inspected positions that had been improved through the previous night's work, checking on men whose faces showed the strain of constant vigilance against enemy sharpshooters. Each afternoon, he wrote letters to the families of soldiers who had died in the assault, struggling to find words that might provide some comfort while avoiding the harsh truth that their loved ones had died in a tactical blunder of historic proportions. The Confederate forces, despite their tactical success, faced their own challenges as the engagement settled into siege warfare. Supplies, always scarce in Lee's army, became even more critical as the need to maintain strong defensive positions prevented the kind of maneuver warfare that had previously allowed Confederate forces to live off captured Union supplies. The victory at Cold Harbor had been purchased with ammunition and resources that the Confederacy could ill afford to expend in prolonged defensive operations. Captain Samuel Williams of the 10th Georgia Infantry, writing in his journal during the siege, captured the strange mixture of triumph and melancholy that characterized the Confederate response to their overwhelming tactical victory. "We have proven that well-prepared defensive positions can defeat any assault," he wrote, "but each day of success brings us closer to the ultimate defeat that numbers and resources make inevitable. We win battles but lose the war, one costly victory at a time." The strategic implications of Cold Harbor began to reshape the thinking of military leaders on both sides. Union commanders, forced to confront the obsolescence of traditional assault tactics, began developing the sophisticated siege warfare techniques that would prove decisive at Petersburg. Confederate leaders, recognizing that their tactical superiority could only delay rather than prevent ultimate defeat, began the psychological preparation for the defensive campaigns that would characterize the war's final year. As June progressed, Cold Harbor became a laboratory for the kind of warfare that would dominate military thinking through the First World War. Trenches, sharpshooters, artillery barrages, and the deadly mathematics of defensive fire superiority created a tactical environment that made heroes of engineers and relegated traditional military virtues of courage and elan to supporting roles in the brutal calculus of industrial warfare. 2 weeks after the assault, Morrison found himself standing in a makeshift cemetery behind the Union lines, watching as graves registration teams worked to identify and bury the dead who had finally been recovered from the killing ground between the armies. The temporary truce that had allowed both sides to collect their casualties had revealed the true human cost of Cold Harbor in stark, unavoidable detail. Bodies that had lain in the Virginia sun for days were often identifiable only by those pathetic scraps of paper that soldiers had pinned to their uniforms in anticipation of death. The psychological impact of Cold Harbor extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Veterans of Gettysburg and Antietam, men who had thought themselves hardened to the realities of war, found themselves questioning the very nature of military service and national purpose. Letters home, subject to military censorship, nevertheless conveyed a sense of disillusionment that would fundamentally alter the Northern public's perception of the war's progress and ultimate meaning. Private Henry Jacobson of the 20th Massachusetts, one of Morrison's surviving soldiers, wrote to his sister in Boston with words that captured the spiritual crisis facing many Union veterans. "We have seen hell itself in these Virginia fields, and I fear that we are no longer the boys who left home with such bright hopes for quick victory. The rebels fight like demons behind their earthworks, and our generals seem to think that courage alone can overcome mathematics and modern rifles. I pray daily for this war to end, but I no longer pray for victory in the way I once did." The strategic lessons of Cold Harbor were not lost on the Union High Command, though their implementation would require fundamental changes in military doctrine and tactical thinking. General Henry Wager Halleck, serving as Chief of Staff, wrote extensive analyses of the battle that would influence Union strategy for the remainder of the war. According to documents preserved in the National Archives, Halleck's reports emphasized the need for sophisticated siege warfare techniques and the obsolescence of traditional assault tactics against prepared defensive positions. Confederate leaders, while celebrating their tactical victory, understood that Cold Harbor represented both their greatest strength and their ultimate weakness. General James Longstreet, recuperating from wounds suffered earlier in the campaign, wrote to Lee that their defensive success had demonstrated Confederate tactical superiority while simultaneously highlighting their strategic impossibility. "We can defeat any Union assault," Longstreet observed, "but we cannot defeat the arithmetic of attrition that makes each defensive victory more costly than the last." The impact of Cold Harbor on American military thinking extended well beyond the immediate participants in the battle. West Point instructors began revising their tactical manuals to reflect the new realities of defensive warfare, while European military observers sent detailed reports to their governments analyzing the implications of American innovations in field fortification and defensive fire coordination. The battle had inadvertently created a preview of the warfare that would dominate the Western Front 50 years later. Morrison, now commanding the remnants of 3 different regiments consolidated due to casualties, found himself responsible for men whose experiences had fundamentally altered their relationship with military authority and national purpose. The easy patriotism that had characterized the early years of the war had been replaced by a grim professionalism that focused on survival rather than glory. His soldiers performed their duties with mechanical efficiency, but their enthusiasm for aggressive action had died in those terrible 30 minutes on June 3rd. The families of Cold Harbor casualties began receiving letters that would reshape American understanding of military sacrifice and national purpose. Unlike the heroic narratives that had characterized earlier war correspondence, these letters spoke of waste, futility, and the terrible human cost of strategic miscalculation. Gold Star mothers and widows began asking questions about military leadership and strategic planning that would influence American civil-military relations for generations to come. As summer deepened, Cold Harbor settled into the routine of siege warfare that would characterize the final year of America's bloodiest conflict. The tactical lessons of June 3rd had been learned at a cost that would haunt American military memory long after the guns fell silent, and the political issues that had caused the war were resolved through exhaustion rather than decisive victory. The evacuation of Cold Harbor began on the night of June 12, 1864, as Grant finally acknowledged that his position had become strategically untenable. Morrison, now a brevet colonel commanding a composite unit formed from the survivors of multiple regiments, supervised the withdrawal with the methodical efficiency that had replaced the martial enthusiasm of earlier campaigns. The Union Army moved south toward the James River under cover of darkness, leaving behind the earthworks and graves that marked one of the war's most tragic miscalculations. As his men filed past in the moonlight, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed expression of soldiers who had seen too much death, Morrison reflected on the transformation that Cold Harbor had wrought in both armies. The Union forces that crossed the James were no longer the confident volunteers who had begun the overland campaign with such high hopes. They were professionals now, hardened by experience and sobered by losses that had stripped away any illusions about the nature of modern warfare. The strategic consequences of Cold Harbor extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Grant's recognition that frontal assaults had become obsolete against prepared defensive positions forced a fundamental revision of Union military doctrine. The siege of Petersburg, which would consume the final months of the war, represented the direct application of lessons learned in the killing fields of Cold Harbor. Artillery preparation, coordinated infantry advances, and sophisticated engineering replaced the heroic charges that had characterized earlier Civil War battles. The human cost of these tactical lessons continued to mount long after the armies departed. Veterans of Cold Harbor carried physical and psychological scars that would influence American society for decades. The survivors' guilt that affected men like Morrison was compounded by the knowledge that their comrades had died in an assault that military historians would later describe as tactically unnecessary and strategically counterproductive. Many veterans found themselves unable to discuss their experiences, creating a generation of silent men who bore witness to the true cost of military innovation. The Confederate Army's tactical victory at Cold Harbor provided temporary validation of Lee's defensive strategy, but the strategic implications were ultimately devastating for the Southern cause. The success of defensive tactics encouraged Confederate commanders to adopt increasingly static positions that surrendered the initiative to Union forces while consuming irreplaceable manpower in holding fortified lines. The tactical lessons that made Cold Harbor a Confederate victory contributed to the strategic thinking that would make Petersburg a Confederate defeat. Private Jacobson, one of Morrison's few surviving original soldiers, wrote to his family from the banks of the James River with observations that captured the war's transformation. "We have learned to fight like engineers rather than soldiers, digging trenches and calculating angles of fire rather than relying on courage and elan." The romance of war died in those Virginia fields, replaced by mathematics and industrial efficiency. "We shall win this conflict, but victory will taste of ashes rather than glory." The memory of Cold Harbor would influence American military thinking well into the 20th century. The tactical lessons of defensive fire superiority, coordinated artillery support, and the obsolescence of frontal assault were studied at West Point and war colleges throughout the world. When American doughboys faced German machine guns and artillery in the trenches of France, they were applying lessons learned in the blood of Virginia 50 years earlier. Morrison survived the war, returning to Massachusetts with a colonel's commission and a chest full of medals that could never compensate for the memories that haunted his dreams. He devoted his remaining years to writing detailed accounts of Cold Harbor, determined that future generations of military leaders would understand the human cost of tactical miscalculation. His memoirs, published in 1892, became required reading at military academies and helped establish Cold Harbor as a case study in the dangers of outdated tactical thinking in the face of modern military technology. The Battle of Cold Harbor stands as one of history's clearest examples of how military innovation and human courage can combine to create tragedy on an unprecedented scale. The soldiers who died in those 30 minutes of June 3, 1864, became casualties not just of enemy fire, but of the inevitable collision between traditional military values and the industrial realities of modern warfare. Their sacrifice provided lessons that would influence military thinking for generations, purchased at a price that no strategic objective could ever justify. In the end, Cold Harbor altered American memory by demonstrating that courage and patriotism, while necessary virtues in military service, were insufficient to guarantee success or even survival in the face of superior defensive positions and modern weapons technology. The battle became a symbol of the war's transformation, from a conflict of heroic individuals to an industrial struggle where victory belonged to those who best understood the mathematics of destruction and the engineering of death.